Good morning. Good morning. Trying to get it shared out as much as I can really quick before we get started. Um, just to make sure that it algorithms well. Hello, Callie. Um, and it seems to me that it is the likes and the shares that kind of seems to bump it in the algorithm. So unlike normal, I'm going to ask that people like and share as much as possible just so that we can bump everything in the algorithm. Um, as I'm trying to make sure that everything bumps up a little bit more in the algorithm at this point. I'm trying to get to where I last left off here. Um, so if you can tap the screen for me, that would be amazing because it will bump it in everybody's algorithm, and I'd appreciate that. Um, Her pupils aren't large, it's just that her eyes are this kind of dark, hazel green gray, and so her pupils look like they're much larger than they are. This is Denny. This is a hybrid between a Neanderthal and a Denisovan, actually. She's not sapien at all. And what we have of her all comes from a like 2-inch chunk of her thigh bone. They have actually new DNA testing stuff that they do, that DNA testing stuff that they do can actually predict different markers, so they can tell whether or not what the size of the nose is, what the size of the lips is, what the color of the eyes is, how the hair was, and stuff like that from this. Um, so roughly 20 years ago, hey, no cap, I have no clue on vaccines. Like, I'm bad at vaccines. I'm glad to know that that's you, though, because I did not know that was you. But like, I don't know vaccines very well. Like, it's not something I've studied a whole lot. So when we look at ancient DNA, 20 years ago, Pablo Svante Pablo, the guy who won the Nobel Peace Prize last year, invented something called polymerase chain reaction. And with the polymerase chain reaction, it gives us the ability to take a singular strand of DNA and replicate it millions of times. And this is how we got to the ability to test ancient DNA. Svante Pablo is out of the Max Planck Institute, and the Max Planck Institute has been working very hard to try and give us more information and more ways to test things. So within the last couple of years, they've actually developed a new kind of way to test, not a way to test the DNA, but a new way to look at the results of the DNA. And so they can extrapolate from that what somebody looked like based on the DNA. This is technically a human because human is the genus Homo. Everything that is the genus Homo is human because Homo means human. So like Homo naledi is human, and Homo erectus is human, and Homo neanderthal is human, and Homo denisovan is human. And this being half Neanderthal and half Denisovan is absolutely technically human. It is not, on the other hand, a Homo sapien. So it is not one of our species at all. It is another species of human. But she is absolutely a human. Yes, we have her as our one of our subscriber little things too. Um, so when we're looking at Denny, what we're seeing is our first DNA evidence of a actual hybrid between two separate human species, because we don't have DNA on any of the other what we believe might be. Yes, Max Planck Institute is amazeballs on so many levels. We don't have DNA on anything else that we're looking at that we think might be an actual hybrid, right? So when they are looking at the different species of human and they're looking at the DNA and we're looking at this hybrid here, we're able to track a few different things within it. Like we can track that she had a Denisovan father and a Neanderthal mother, and that she I might have that backwards because it has been a hot minute since we talked about it, but I know at least 2 or 3 people in the chat currently No, because I think that there's people in the chat currently who have said so before. Um, she, we know which one of her parents comes from which species. We know that she was 13 years old when she died, roughly 90,000 years ago. And from the DNA, we can extrapolate what she looked like. So this is what we believe this 13-year-old child looked like. Now, you might go, well, she looks really old for 13. And this is true. She looks really old for our idea of what a 13-year-old would look like. This comes from the fact that they now believe that there is this kind of layer that we create over our skin to protect our skin up to 30,000 years ago. And this kind of layer that we created over our skin to protect our skin up to roughly 30,000 years ago comes from this it's like a build-up of skin cells and oils, and it kind of gives this almost sunscreen protection to our skin, but it also made us look what we would consider older. um, and so when we're looking at someone like like Denny, we're seeing somebody who is going to look a little bit older than what our idea of somebody at this age should look. This is technically nobody's ancestor that's alive today. This is again somebody who is half Neanderthal and half Denisovan. And there are many people who are Homo sapiens who have both Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA with them. I would actually state that you almost certainly have Neanderthal DNA in you. Absolutely, almost certainly. There's only two populations on the earth, and they're both in Africa that don't have Neanderthal DNA in them. So, absolutely a cousin of you as well as of me, right? So the people who named Denny are the people who discovered Denny. And again, I believe that Denny is coming out of, I know a lot of her information is coming out of the Max Planck Institute. I don't know if the Max Planck Institute is actually the lead archaeologist or geneticist on the dig itself. The find of Denny comes from the Denisovan cave, and the Denisovan cave has literally thousands of pieces of bone, and all the little pieces, excuse me, all the little pieces of bone that they have, none of them are over like 2 inches. One second, I don't know if you can't hear me anymore. Can you hear me okay, or did I go mute? Let me know if I went mute, please. Okay, perfect. There are people in Africa. So, cavemen is really kind of a misnomer. There are ancient people in Africa. Absolutely. We find our oldest people in Africa. And actually, we definitely find the vast majority of our people in Africa, they're ancient people in caves. So, I'm not sure with that question. Because, like, first of all, we have this idea that cavemen means something more primitive than it did. And second of all, the vast majority of the finds that we have are all in caves. Naledi is actually only found in caves, and Naledi is one of our older finds, not oldest, but one of our older finds of, human beings, and it is like 335,000 to 235,000 years ago, and it's a cave in South Africa. Yes, there are archaic hominids in Turtle Island like the Americas. So let me go over things from top to bottom. We got stuck on Denny originally because she was the one that came up. But let me go over a couple of things because I have seen them already in the chat. So science and medicine being indigenous is because science and medicine predate us. We see science in Homo erectus and we see medicine in Neanderthals. And since science and medicine predate us, what we're looking at is something that is a part of the animistic tradition and the ancient tradition that all of us are. The 31,000-year-old find of a foot amputation in Borneo is absolutely an indigenous people in Borneo, right? We see in the plaque and the dentition of Neanderthals, herbology. We also see healing of limbs and broken bones and things like that or in Neanderthals. When we see when we're looking at those things, we're definitely seeing early medicine. Scientists, hold on a second. Yes, okay. Science is something that we see as early as Homo erectus. Science is I observe something in nature, I have a hypothesis of what that observation might mean. I predict what that hypothesis means, and then I test it. And if the testing proves true, then I have a theory. And if the testing doesn't prove true, then I have to go back to the original hypothesis and redo that original hypothesis. So when we are looking at that, what we're seeing is science and medicine science goes back to Erectus. You see that Erectus had the use of fire. And Erectus is the first to take the original stone tools that we see with Paranthropus boisei, which is the Otawan tool complex, and take that into a new tool complex, the Acheulean hand axe complex, adapt the adaptations. And you see that our first ability to cross water comes with Erectus, and our first ability to have clothing comes with Erectus. All of these things are very, very much a sorry, this chat is a little distracting sometimes. I really try. If it gets bad, one of my mods in here, please make sure do a comment to turn off comments, and I am post it, pin it, and I'll make sure that I turn off comments because I know it can get bad when it gets a little high. So when we're looking at even Erectus, we see this advent of science even as far back as Erectus. And because we see this advent of science even as far back as Erectus, we can see that science and then seeing medicine in Neanderthals and many indigenous cultures are very indigenous things. We do not see the loss of science and medicine in indigenous cultures until you see Christianity moving into those cultures and erasing it. uh, when we're looking at that, I take it that you were trying to block that one and it came across as a pin instead. When we are looking at that, what we are seeing is that science and medicine are really far back in who we are. When you see the Europeans get to Turtle Island, which is North America, and Abayala, which is South America, you absolutely see that Europeans actually document the extensive science and medicine that they see here among the indigenous people. You see that science and medicine still exist today in the indigenous people across the globe, the Sami, the Ainu, the Amazigh. You see that these things have existed throughout time in these people, and it is only in spaces that colonialism of Christianity comes in, or colonialism based on a Christian thought process comes in and erases these things. This comes from the fact that Christianity is very much about, especially in its early times, very much about not questioning God and very much about not playing God with medicine, right? Oh my God. Listen, I will turn off comments if y'all continue. I will turn them back on so that those of you who are actually like trying to learn can ask questions later. I am going to ask a couple things that I didn't bring up first because there weren't a lot of people, and most of the people in here actually know this space. This space is a space that TikTok gives me. If you get to 1,000 followers, you get this space as well. You can use it any way you want to use it. I use this space to teach. And I use this space to teach because education is gate kept behind $40,000 a year paywalls and huge languages. And because of that, a lot of people don't have access to it. I teach that race doesn't exist, that racism does exist, and I teach how to avoid these things, how to get through these things, and who we truly are going back throughout history. Race is something that was invented by Europeans to justify the atrocities that they were committing. And we are trying to get rid of the idea that race exists. When we are in my space, I don't appreciate racist comments and I don't deal with phobias based on gender and desire. If you are going to do that, then you need to go somewhere else, or you'll be blocked or treated accordingly. In this space, kindness is key. I am doing a kindness, I am doing a service, and I ask that kindness is returned. I am doing this with love, and I am doing this with care, and I am asking that that is returned. Also, keep your Bible out of my space. Your Bible is horrific on so many levels and teaches really crappy shit, and I don't want it in my space. Keep your religion out. So what we are going over today are a few different things that are way, way earlier than you think. They all predate your ideas. They all predate the indoctrination that you live in. Because if I can show you who we truly are, who we were before this indoctrination, then maybe you can see that you're not innately evil. You are, in fact, innately nurturing, innately curious, and innately communal. And maybe you can get out of this idea of othering and get out of this idea of being controlled by a government that is out to kill you and thinks that if it well, has proven that if it can convince you that it's somebody else to hate instead of the shit that they're doing to you, then they can continue to kill you. So you can be kind in this space or we cannot. All of my sources are compiled on the inwitaor.com website. This is my website. It has bibliographies on it. So the sources for my things are compiled on there. I don't have a teaching certificate. A teaching certificate is something that you need to teach in a college, maybe, or teach in a grade school, maybe. I have degrees in the subjects that I talk about. I don't need a teaching certificate because I'm not trying to enter an academic space because I'm trying to change academic space and because I'm not trying to make you pay me to learn, right? Because again, academia gatekeeps everything, and I don't want to be a part of that gatekeeping. So let's go again back into these things. Science and medicine absolutely being indigenous are things that we see that predate Christian colonialism in all spaces and that predate our understanding. We see that science goes as far back as Homo erectus and that medicine goes as far back as Neanderthals. And all of these things are maintained in space until about 400 Common Era when Christianity takes over and eradicates them. Okay, so when you see Christianity taking over, you see that the Egyptians, that the Celts, that the Germanic people, that the Asian peoples, that the Mongol people, the people across the globe actually have really extensive science and really extensive medicine until Christianity kind of erases it. And we actually see that those things are maintained in spaces that Christianity doesn't take over. You see that people in 1400, people in 1600 are going to Islamic spaces to learn medicine and to learn science because Islam maintains science and medicine where Christianity eradicates science and medicine. Denny, the person on the screen behind me, this beautiful person, is a 13-year-old child that we have found from roughly 90,000 years ago. We have a little piece of her leg bone that we have found in the Denisovan Cave. And the Denisovan Cave has thousands of little pieces of bone. And currently they're dating and testing all of these little pieces of bones and trying to make sure that they get as much information. This is how we actually found the whole new species of Denisovan. Denny is a half Neanderthal and half Denisovan hybrid. Her father was a Denisovan and her mother was a Neanderthal. And because of this, we have some kind of information about how hybridization between these two different species works. We know that she's biologically female because of the DNA testing. This is also how we get her physique and what she looks like, because there's new testings and new ways to look at the testing that can extrapolate all that information from the DNA. All of this coming out of the Max Planck Institute. Now, when you're looking at the understanding of who Denny is and who the Neanderthals are and the Denisovans are and how they're intermixing, this gives us a lot of information on things like the fact that most of the early species of human, again, human being Homo, which is the genus that we belong to, and the genus that Neanderthal and Denisovan and Naledi and Erectus and Heidelbergensis all belong to. Many species that share the genus Homo have a tendency to live in bands and groups together. When we look at the word tribe versus the word band, a tribe is based on genetic lineage and a band is not based on genetic lineage. So a band is based on many different people from many different family groups, or in this case, species, that come together to form a community so that they can maintain safety for everybody within that community. Whereas a tribe is based on the actual genetic lineage. Maybe you have an ancient matriarch who has created all the different clans from her different daughters, and men marry into those clans. This is a tribe based on genetic lineage, right? So when we look at Denisovan, and again, Denny herself was found in the Denisova cave in Russia. When we look at the Denisovan and we look at the Neanderthal and we look at Denisova cave, we can actually see that Denisovan and Neanderthal and Sapien all lived together in this cave in bands. They all lived together through long periods of time in these caves, and they actually were able to create in many parts, part of who we are today. Now, Denny doesn't have any sapien in her, and as a 13-year-old, she doesn't have any descendants, so she's nobody's ancestor, but she is kind of our cousin. And she is somebody who gives us a lot of information on how all of this mixes up together and how this comes together, which really ties into our thought process that evolution is not linear. So I see a lot of this, and a lot of these are pretty racist comments within my chat. Y'all want to take the idea that we're all separate species, or that, this belongs to one group and this doesn't belong to another group. So Neanderthal is in literally everybody on this planet, unless you belong to the Oyo population of West Africa or the Kwe population of South Africa, which have 3 other species that are ghost species within them. So this is you, and we are not separate species. This is all of us. Get bent. I'm really sick and tired of the that's you, that's not me, because it's you too. And you can either learn your history and learn that you're an amazing fucking being, or you can continue along the indoctrination of white supremacy that tries to tell you that certain people are better than other people, instead of understanding that we're all pretty much the fucking same. And if we were all as nurturing and communal as we're supposed to be, maybe we wouldn't be in this shitstorm that we are. And you can continue to worship the government that's indoctrinating and killing you, or you can learn the truth about who you are. You, ye, whatever, do you. But if you don't want to do this, scroll the fuck on. Keep your shit to yourself and scroll the fuck on, okay? And I'm so mixed, there's not a space I don't come from. So if it's you, it's me, boo. Period. Period, period, period. There's not a space I don't come from. So recently they put out, though most people who work in the field of evolution have known this for a long period of time, recently they have put out the fact that evolution is not linear. And what they mean by the fact that evolution is not linear is that we have this knowledge now that evolution doesn't just go straight forward. Evolution goes forward and backwards and side to side. And I personally find Homo naledi to be one of those really fascinating examples of how evolution is not linear within humans. Homo naledi is the species that we have found in the Rising Star Cave in Johannesburg, South Africa. And Homo naledi is a species that actually compiles many different kind of species within it, it seems. And not only that, but it seems that Homo naledi actually kind of goes a step forward into a space that we didn't see for a long fucking time. Okay, yeah, the cognitive dissonance. Oh my God. So when we look at Homo naledi, what we see is a species whose lower body is like Homo erectus at the time, right? Homo naledi is 335,000. So before we're there, 335,000 years ago to 235,000 years ago. By 235,000 years ago, we had just started coming on the scene, but we hadn't solidified to what we are currently as Homo sapiens. Homo naledi is a species whose lower body is like ours and like erectus, which was the species that was around at the time, okay? And so when you look at Homo naledi's lower body, you're seeing something that stays the same as everything else in its space. When you look at Homo naledi's upper body, Homo naledi kind of goes back 3 million years, or well, I guess by that point, like 202.75 million years, right? Because we look at Homo naledi's upper body and we see Australopithecine. Australopithecine is Lucy. Australopithecine is those small brain, kind of more climby species that we see prior to Homo erectus. And when we look at naledi, we see that their upper body is Australopithecine. Not only that, but their brain size is Australopithecine. They have a small brain and a small head. They have, well, not comparison body, but small brain, small head. And they have curved fingers for climbing and curved toes for climbing. They're a climbing species, and they are an expediently bipedal species like we are. And so we see that this species has not only staying the same where it is, but goes back a few million years to a different species. And then we see this absolutely fascinating thing within it. When we come about, our brains are shaped like this: forehead, spine, back of brain, okay? Currently, our brains are shaped like this: forehead, spine, back of brain. We currently understand that it is this shape that gives us the connections, the understanding that we have now. Whereas When we had this shape, we didn't have the connection and understanding. We didn't bury our dead. We didn't have cave art. We didn't decorate self. And we didn't um, have a conscious idea of further life after death. Homo naledi has this brain shape. We don't see this brain shape in us until about 30 to 40,000 years ago. So 200 to 300,000 years before we get this brain shape, Homo naledi has this brain shape. And recently we've understood that this means that Homo naledi, the brain shape is partially why they bury their dead, and they are the first species to bury their dead. They have cave art, and they're the first species that have cave art, and it looks like some of it might be writing, which is really weird, or at least marking where people are, signifying things, which is really weird because we don't see that in us until roughly like 27,000 years ago. And then the other thing that we see with Homo naledi is that they have the ability to move with fire, meaning that they carry torches through the cave systems that they're using to bury their dead. They have ceremony, they have worship. So this is completely dependent and completely because of the brain shape. So when we look at Homo naledi, we see something that absolutely proves that evolution isn't linear, because we see something that proves that not only have we gone to the same space that we were already in staying the same in the lower body, but we're actually moving backwards in the upper body and forwards in the shape of the brain, right? Um, on Homo naledi, Zebek, actually, what is it? There's a current documentary on Netflix, and it's Cave something, and I can't remember. I watched it recently. I know a couple people in here have it. Netflix. Doc Homo naledi. I can give you the name really quick. Unknown Cave of Bones. And that is about Homo naledi. That's not about the rest of the topics within here. You can look at the sources on the Inwood Ord site underneath the bibliographies section, and it will give you a lot of this different information. But there aren't documentaries on a lot of this. Absolutely, Zebek. And so Naledi is really a beautiful example of how evolution isn't linear. Yes, Naledi is from the Rising Star Cave System in South Africa next to Johannesburg. And so when we're looking at Naledi, there is just so much fascinating information coming out of Homo naledi. So when we're looking at Homo naledi, this fascinating evidence of evolution not being linear all in one species really gives weight to the scientific discoveries that have been put out recently that evolution is not linear. When we're looking at that, it really also ties into a lot of the other species that we saw and that we lived with. Now, the most recent information coming out of my field, which is archaeology and anthropology, is that we actually our existence as a species does not come in the way that most species speciates. So when we look at the way that Neanderthal speciates, what our understanding of is in the way that Neanderthal speciates and in most species speciates is in isolation. So say we have Homo erectus, and certain groups of Homo erectus leave Africa, which we know like 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus is already leaving Africa. So Homo erectus starts leaving Africa at 1.8 million years ago. Homo erectus going into Northwest Europe as Homo heidelbergensis and starts speciating into different species in there in Northwest Europe or Eurasia. When it's looking at speciating, or when it speciates in different species in Northwest Eurasia, it's already kind of heidelbergensis-y, but then it speciates down into Homo neanderthal. Homo neanderthal comes because erectus is in isolation in this space, because it's only one group of Homo erectus. See, we look at Homo erectus and we see several different subspecies of Homo erectus. We see Heidelbergensis, antecessor, or ergaster. All of these are different subspecies of Homo erectus. Neanderthal, we believe, comes out of Heidelbergensis, again, a subspecies of erectus. Now, when we're looking in Africa, where we come out into being, and currently our understanding is that's all of Africa. All of Africa is where, we're starting out. When we're looking at that, what we're seeing is, again, those bands that I was talking about. Again, tribe is based on genetic lineage, whereas band is not. It's based on many groups of different genetics coming together to form a community. So when you get Homo heidelbergensis and Homo antecessor and Homo ergaster and Homo erectus all in one community together, and all of them in one community together are intermixing and interbreeding, we end up with Homo sapien. Now, our oldest Homo sapien, Don, every species, everybody on the planet except for the Oyo population of West Africa and the Kwe population of South Africa, which have three ghost species in them, has Neanderthal. So when I'm talking about Neanderthal, we are talking about your ancestors, almost completely independent of where you come from, with the exception of if you belong to those two populations and have no admixture from anywhere else. Okay, so we are talking about all of us. When we're looking at Neanderthal, again, they speciate out of isolation, but when we look at sapien, we speciate out of convergence. We speciate out of many different peoples coming together. And when we see all of these different people coming together, all of those different people coming together create sapien. Now, our current understanding is that our oldest currently is in Morocco, right? And it's 300,000 years old. And we're finding others roughly around the same time in Africa. And our current understanding is that there's roughly two or three groups of early Homo sapiens initially, and it is then the convergence of those groups of early Homo sapiens, which again come out of the convergence of other species, that creates the Homo sapien population that we have today. And that Homo sapien population that we have today I'll get to that question in a second. The Homo sapien population that we have today doesn't really start becoming that population until 335 to 235, or sorry, 135 to 125,000 years ago is when we solidify as a species. By this time, we're already outside of Africa in the Levant area, and we've already been mixing with Neanderthal. Now, that's a really good question. Why do those spaces, again, the only two spaces on the planet that do not have Neanderthal, that have three ghost species in them, how do they not have Neanderthal? Again, this is the Oyo population of West Africa, and it is, I said Morocco because it's North Africa, and I specified North Africa like three friggin' times, so no. The Oyo population of West Africa and the Kwe population of South Africa. And the reason that you see this happening is because as we are living in the Levant area, in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, in this area, which at this time is still actually part of Africa because of the fact that the water levels are low, so that sea there between the peninsula and Africa doesn't really exist. When we're living in this area and mixing with Neanderthals, many people are going back into Africa. And this is how we see Neanderthal genetics within African people pre-colonization. This comes from finds of bones, finds of people pre-colonization, right? So this is not introduced by Europeans coming in. What this is that as people are mixing with Neanderthals in this space, they're moving back into Africa and they're carrying these genetics back into Africa with them. And when they carry genetics back into Africa with them, they're taking that Neanderthal genetics across Africa. I would think that since the Oyo population and the Kwe population both have the same three ghost species in them, and that our understanding of the Kwe population being the oldest population, the oldest group that we have, the oldest original population again. And we know this because we see that the Kwe population has all the genetics that you can possibly find in the human genome. It has one of the oldest languages on the planet. When we see this, I would think that the Oyo population and the Kwe population might have originally been one population and that they didn't have that intermixed back. I do not know absolute for certain why they don't have Neanderthal and they only have those, well, not only, and they have those three ghost species that aren't seen anywhere else. I don't know that specifically, but that would be the conclusion that I would draw from the evidence that I currently have. And nobody is 100% human. And this is because we like to fuck everything. We're really good at having intimacy with anything, especially if it looks unusual. We like things that look unusual. And if we look at something as hot or see something that's new, we want to get in bed with that. We're like, ooh, I ain't never seen something that looks like you before. You want to come back to my tent? Like that's how we look at it. And so we literally have admixture from everything. We've always had admixture. Admixture is us. We are literally created out of admixture. And because we are literally created out of admixture, and because it's not until 10,000 years ago in narcissistic god kings and stratification and the need to keep you in your place that we get the idea of othering, or somebody else must be different than us and they must be less than us and we must be better than somebody else and we're unique and we're special, blah, 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 blah. Because of that being such a relatively recent thing in our species, we know that as we're moving across the planet, we just envelop everybody into us. We're just like, oh, hey, baby, what's up? The documentary, yes, documentary is only on the Naledi, and it is Cave of Bones on Netflix. But it's not about what we're talking about right now. It's only on Naledi. Some of the information about what we're talking about right now is found in the sources on my website. So when we see us as a species, we see that there is admixture everywhere. There is not a single human on this planet today. There's not a single sapien on this planet today that does not have admixture from at least one other species. At least one other species. And for the most part, all of Africa and all of Western Eurasia is sapien and Neanderthal. It's everywhere else that has other species within them, right? We can see several other species within us, and that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about. What other species do we see within us? Currently, we can track 7 different species within Homo sapiens today. The Homo sapiens today that we have across the globe gotten full genomes on, we can see these different species within them. What we see within this is that Neanderthal is literally in everybody across the globe, again, except for those 2 populations in Africa, the Oyo population in West Africa and the Kwe population in South Africa. And outside of Neanderthal, the other species that we have found in the fossil record that we can compare to us is the Denisovan species. When we look at the Denisovan species, we see that the Denisovan species is in Southeast Asia, the islands of the South Pacific, the continent of in Indigenous Australians, and in Turtle Islanders, Indigenous Turtle Islanders. Now, when we look at Indigenous Turtle Islanders and the amount of Denisovan that we have in it, that we have within us, we see that Indigenous Turtle Islanders have 0.02 to 0.03% Denisovan. And the way that geneticists and scientists have calculated this out, it states that we spent about 10,000 years intermixing with Denisovan to get that 0.02 to 0.03% within us Indigenous Turtle Islanders. When you look at Indigenous Turtle Islanders and Indigenous Australians, you start to see more ghost species. Within Indigenous Australians, there is one ghost species, and within Indigenous Turtle Islanders, there is another ghost species. What we're seeing with this is species that were in Australia and in Turtle Island that are descendant species of Homo erectus that were enveloped by the indigenous populations that are currently there when those populations moved into those areas. In Australia, we have the Moy Hill site, which is 120,000 years old. It is fire-cracked rock and fire soot staining, and it is food products that have been broken apart to eat. When we look at Turtle Island, which is again North America, we see that there is a 130,000-year-old find in Turtle Island. This is the Cerruti mastodon find. The word more is a slur. The word more is a slur, just so you're aware. It's actually so more and Berber are both slurs for a group of people in the northern part of Africa. The Amazigh are one population of Tayozi people in North Africa, but more is a slur, just so you're aware. When we are looking at Indigenous Turtle Islanders and Indigenous Australians having having ghost species within them, what we're looking at is those 2 sites. Now, when we look at Homo erectus and the other species that we see across the board, yes, to the people that are called that's a slur. They would prefer to be called Amazigh or, oh, fuck me. Let me see. I have to look at it to. I don't have it. I do have a couple of Amazon creators who have the actual name for the entirety of the population. Amazon is one nation within the population, but that word is a slur. And it starts with a T. I know that one. So when we're looking at that, thank you, Tamazig. And the Tamazig are the overall people, but the word more and the word Berber is slurs for those people. Yeah, and that's what it is that it is what has been used by the Europeans to colonize. It's like Kwesan is actually a slur. Using san or kwe instead is preferable if you can't use the clicks that are used to pronounce it correctly. So I really try to make sure that as I learn things are slurs that I pass that information on so that we can always make sure that we're not imposing our slurs onto other people, right? So that's so fucking cute. So my understanding from an actual Amazon person is that Amazon is their word for their one of the nations within those groups of people, just so that you know. And that's from an actual currently living in, currently a part of, person who is Amazon. So um, back to the species within us. When we're looking at indigenous turtle islanders and abayalians, we see that there is a ghost species. Ghost species is a species where we see just this little bit of information within us, but we haven't found the species in the fossil record yet. And so we don't have a full genome. So we call them a ghost species. So we do have 6 ghost species that we have found in the DNA of us and in the DNA of Neanderthal and Denisovan. One is within the DNA in Neanderthal and Denisovan that we don't see within us, and then 5 that we see within us. Again, 3 that we see within the Oyo and the Kwe people of Africa, and then 2 that we see outside of Africa, 1 in Australians who are indigenous and 1 in Turtle Islands and Aboriginals who are indigenous. The newest information, the newest finds that we have are the Moy Hill site in Australia, which is 120,000 years old, which would be a Homo erectus descendant that had made it to Australia, that speciates in Australia, and then would be that in ghost species that we see in indigenous Australians. The newest one here in Turtle Islands is 100, well, it's not the newest, but one of the ones here in Turtle Island is 130,000 years old. It's the Cerruti Mastodon site, and it is in San Diego. And it is juvenile mammoth bones in situ with stone tools. And this is indicative of another Homo erectus species that you're seeing that has made it across. Now, when we look at Homo erectus, we see that Homo erectus really makes it across the globe. When we're looking at the different places that we see species speciated from Homo erectus, we see one in an island in Indonesia that you absolutely have to cross water to get to, and one in an island in the Philippines that you also have to cross water to get to. There is this space called the Wallace Trench that is between the continent of Eurasia and the continent of Australia. And the Wallace Trench is so deep that it has never been above sea level. So to get to spaces within the Wallace Trench, which was where Flores Island is, the island of Indonesia that has Homo florensis, or below the Wallace Trench, which is the island of Luzon in the Philippines, which is where Homo luzonensis, one of the latest finds that we have, is coming from. This means that Homo erectus had to cross water to get to these spaces. We also see that the Moy Hill site in Australia and the Cerruti Mastodon site in Turtle Island are also where erectus is crossing water. Now, how do we know that these are species speciated from Homo erectus and not just early Homo sapiens? We know this because at 130,000 years ago, Homo sapien hasn't coalesced into Homo sapien yet. A, and B, Homo sapien hasn't left the Levant area or the Saudi Arabian Peninsula area. And because of this, we know that these groups in these two spaces that don't have Homo sapien within them yet have to be speciated from Homo erectus. And then when we see that there is the ghost species within the indigenous people of those two groups, it doubles down on the knowledge that we are looking at a Homo erectus speciation. It does actually mean that something is happening simultaneously in several different spaces. It means that Homo erectus is speciating simultaneously in several different spaces. Homo erectus is speciating in Eurasia, in two or three different parts of Eurasia at the same time, and is speciating in the island of Flores and in the island of Luzon, and in Australia and in Turtle Island, just as they are speciating in South Africa and North Africa at that time. So, um, we are all the same species. We are all Homo sapien. And we know this because we can have babies really easily. If we were not all the same species, our children would not be viable. When we bred, we would have children that didn't make it out of the womb most of the time. And those that did make it out of the womb might not make it to adulthood, like Denny, only being 13 years old as a hybrid of two different species. And we would see that most aren't fertile. I definitely are usually like to take this to one that most people understand. Most people understand mules. Mules are a hybrid between a donkey and a horse. Donkey and horse both belong to the equine genus, just like we belong to the Homo genus, right? And because donkey as a species and horse as a species, yes, we did not, that's not what I'm saying on any level. Okay, so because donkey and horse are both species, that fall underneath the equine genus, they have a common ancestor that's recent, so they can breed together. But because one has 64 chromosomes and one has 62 chromosomes, most of the time their children have 63 chromosomes. And that uneven number doesn't split right. And so they end up not being able to be fertile. Every once in a while, a female, and it's always a female in mammals, mule will be born that is fertile, and that mule has to breed back to one of the species that parented it. So either to a horse or to a donkey, right? So when we're looking at that, what we're seeing is the hybridization between two species. And this is what happened with Neanderthal and Denisovan in Denny behind me. And this is what happened in us and how we have these other species within us. Again, currently we see 7 different species within Homo sapien. It is all across the globe, and it is different species in different spaces for the most part, except for Neanderthal, which again we see everywhere except for the Oyo population of West Africa and the Kwe population of South Africa. So with Neanderthal, what we're seeing is that as Homo sapien is, or kind of converging into its species, it's already living with and mixing with Neanderthal. It's already knowing who Neanderthal is. And because of the fact that they're already mixing with and knowing who Neanderthal is as they're coalescing as a species, the vast majority of us have Neanderthal within us, except for, again, those two populations. Those two populations have 3 ghost species in them. Again, ghost species are species we see a little fingerprint of, just like we see Neanderthal and Denisovan as a fingerprint in our DNA, but we haven't found the whole genome, so we don't know what the whole species looks like, right? Why straight hair and being born with a tail? So there's a couple of different theories on why straight hair and why kinky hair. The current theory on why we all or why we all started with tightly coiled hair or kinky hair, or what is classified as 4C hair using the racial classifications that we're all trying to get away from. When we're looking at that, there's been some studies done by Black anthropologists who also have experience with hairdressing, so they have a thought process on this and an understanding of this. And the studies have shown that the tightly kinky hair, the tightly coiled hair, actually comes as a protection from the sun. So when we're looking at different speciations of species, what we're seeing is that speciation comes from adapting to a place. Neanderthal speciates in their place because they're adapting to this space, right? This is why Neanderthal, when they speciate is shorter and stockier because this retains heat better. They speciate with lighter skin because they need to get the vitamin D. It's vitamin D, right? Fuck off my brain sometimes. They need to get things from the sun. And so their skin is lighter. They speciate with less melanin. We all have melanin. Everybody has melanin. Some people just have a little bit less of a concentration of melanin than other people. Vitamin D. Thank you, Callie. You know my brain sometimes. So because they need vitamin D from the sun, and they're living in a space that has heavy cloud cover. Neanderthal speciates lighter. We know that lighter eyes come from the fact that when you have light eyes, it's for a low light environment. When you have dark eyes, it's for a high light environment. I have extremely light eyes. I have gray eyes. And because I have gray eyes, if I go out in the sun, it can hurt. It can give me headaches. Whereas somebody who has darker eyes has less of a chance of getting headaches and less of a chance of that hurting. When we look at Rh negative does not mean that. Rh negative means that out of the 43 Rh factors that surround your blood, you don't have one. There's still the other 42. And you don't have Rh factor capital D. You have all the other Rh factors. But anyways, a sidetracked. When you're looking at Neanderthal speciation, we see that they speciate in a low light environment. When we're looking at Homo sapiens speciation, we see that Homo sapiens speciates in a high light environment. Because Homo sapiens speciates in a high light environment, it speciates very tall and lean because this gives us the ability to dissipate that heat better. It speciates with a darker color of skin with a higher melanin content because this protects UV radiation. It protects from overdosing on vitamin D. And when we look at them, we also see that they speciate with tightly coiled hair because this creates a lattice work on top of the head. And this lattice work on top of the head creates a shade environment that actually gives an airflow. And this shade environment that actually gives an airflow prevents the brain from boiling, basically. Just like with Neanderthal, when they speciate with a very broad, very large nose and this protuberance, which allows the air to heat before it gets to the brain because all of their sinus cavities is back there and it allows it to cycle through the sinus cavity and warm up before it gets to the brain. So, and again, all of these things are from scientific journals. You can find the sources on this website. You can really go down whatever road you want to, but I am talking about actual science that I have actual sources for. And if you don't like it, that's not my problem. That's yours. And that's your issues and your indoctrination and your unwillingness to learn. The last one that I was just talking about was written by a Black person, a Black woman who absolutely is an archaeologist and anthropologist who absolutely knows. So I, as an Indigenous human being who's extremely mixed, don't really do a lot of white science, just so you know. You think I'm white, but I'm not. Just not. You just think I am. I have this beautifully light armor that protects me, and I use it to help others, right? And use it to armor others. But, I've never done. That's not me. So when we're looking at that, we're seeing that speciation gives us this different abilities in different spaces because we're adapting to different spaces. When we're looking at all of this, absolutely. The correct insult that you're trying to do is $5 Indian, and I'm not, but thank you. So science that is focused on European is white science. Science that uses a European focus and a European ideology is white science. So when we're looking at the different species that we see within us, we do see seven different species within us. And when we see those 7 different species within us, we are absolutely able to trace where people were at, how people migrated, and where different species of Homo erectus speciated at, right? Again, we can see within So I'm going to turn this off for a while just because it makes it hard for me and makes it hard for everybody else. We'll turn them back on to ask questions because it is important to me to be able to get questions out of people so that people can learn what they're trying to actually learn. But because of the fact that it can get very distracting, And because people are being willfully ignorant and not listening to things or misinterpreting or stating that I'm saying something that I didn't, it can get really distracting. And it also means that a lot of people are really trying to argue what's being said in the comments when there it kind of lessens their ability to focus on what they're trying to focus on. It's actually very rude of you to sit in somebody else's space and make the shitty, absolutely hateful comments that you're making and trying to detract and trying to, shift. I personally have come from a space where my entire life I have watched and tried to combat the oppression of all the different groups that I come from. I spent my entire life learning about all the different groups that I come from the first time I learned to read, from archaeological texts. Um, I grew up within Indigenous communities as an Indigenous human being. I have known about my Black Sudanese grandmother who escaped slavery my entire life. I spent a lot of time studying what that meant for her and what that meant for other people. I have known about the fact that my ancestry is literally global, and I have spent a lot of time really, really digging down into understanding from their own perspective, not from a white perspective, but from the perspective of the people who actually lived it, because I have known since I knew anything that people would write or tell a story that was based on those that conquered thought process and not based on what was actually going on for the people who were living through the conquering, right? This is something that I have lived with my whole life and I have tried and combated my whole life. I've stood on front lines my whole life and I have been a part of trying to combat that thought process my whole life. We talk in here about the fact that race theory has been debunked. Race is a theory that was developed along with the theory of evolution and along with the theory of eugenics. And it was developed to justify the atrocities that Europeans have been committing for the last few hundred years. They could no longer justify them through their Bible, so they started justifying them through this theory that was not created in a lot of science. And once we got new tools and new understandings, we were able to eradicate the idea of race. And the reason that we know that race doesn't exist, and let me tell you what race is. Race states that because of my skin tone, I might feel pain more than somebody. I might be more intelligent than somebody simply based on my skin tone. It doesn't go into any of my history. It doesn't go into any of my ancestry. It doesn't go into any of my genetics. It states what my skin tone states, and that's it. When we look at the full genome, when we get an idea through DNA what the full genome is, we absolutely see that within a primary population, there is more genetic difference than there are between primary populations. The Kwe population of South Africa has all the genetics that you can find on this entire planet for Homo sapiens. There is all the genes for Homo sapiens in the Kwe population of South Africa. So if somebody lives in the Kwe population in South Africa, they're going to be more genetically different from their next door neighbor than they are going to be from somebody in a primary population in, say, Sweden. They might have the same genes as somebody in the primary population of Sweden because all the genetics are in the Kwe people of South Africa, right? When we look at the full genome, we see that race doesn't exist. And again, the theory of race states that where you're from or the color of your skin dictates your intelligence, dictates whether you can feel pain, dictates whether you should be controlled by others, dictates whether or not you're primitive, dictates whether or not you're good at sports, dictates whether or not you're good at things, right? This is something that has been absolutely and completely debunked. Race does not exist. Racism exists, culture exists, ethnicity exists, but this is a colonial construct meant to keep certain people in their place. I don't buy into it, never bought into it. And we frequently talk in here about how it was debunked. Okay. We're currently not talking about our species, except to talk about the other species that we see within our species. So we can't equate this to race on any level. And another thing with looking at the species that come within our species that we can't equate to race on any level is one that I explain in a couple of videos, but I'm going to go over it here. In the continent of Africa, you have two groups, the Oyo population and the Kwe population, that have three ghost species in them. But everybody else in Africa pre-colonization has 1 to 3% Neanderthal in them. Everybody in Western Eurasia has 1 to 3% Neanderthal in them. And like Africa, other than those two populations, they don't have any other species. So if species equates race and the ghost species or the extra species equates race, Africa and Western Eurasia are the same race, except for the Oyo and the Kwe people of Africa. So you cannot equate different species within us to different races. That's not how it works. Okay. And when we're looking at these things, we have to understand that the reason that we have all of these other species within us is because the othering that you're using, the indoctrination that you're using, the othering that you're following, that comes from government trying to keep control, Europeans trying to justify their atrocities. This all comes from roughly 10,000 years ago in the start of othering, which is used to control you. So you can buy into it all you want. But if you do, don't bitch about how the government's trying to kill you, because you're helping them do it. Period. This idea that you and I are different, this is so that they can give you somebody to hate other than them. Will they steal from you? Will they take from you? Will they keep you under their thumb? Buy into it all you want, but don't bitch. Just buy into it and go your own fucking way, because I don't deal with it. I personally have put in enough knowledge and study to know that they have been trying to kill us for their benefit for 10,000 years. I can trace it back. I have theses that I've written on the fact that this is narcissistic god kings still trying to stratify us and using different things. And that othering went from the barbarians in the hills are going to steal your grain, so you must pay me to provide the soldiers to protect them from stealing your grain in your grain, so I'm stealing it. 2, that other nation isn't as good as our nation and they're trying to steal from you, so pay me so that they can't steal from you, right? That whole protection payment scheme. 2, that other religion. Well, actually, it kind of goes to that other gender first, because the idea that women are lesser comes in before the idea that the other religion is lesser. So it does go into othering women before it goes into othering of religion. Then it goes into othering of religion. And when you get to the point that Europeans land in Turtle Island, or well, actually land in Abiyala and start eradicating and committing genocide, you get into the idea of race. This starts with the biblical thought process, and then goes into race as a science, but we know it's not now, and it's really a atrocification or a justification for atrocity. After that, we get into things like immigrants and the homeless, right? So, as the government is trying to tell you that the person down the street is who you should be angry at, they're stealing from you, they're taking from you, they're keeping you down. And if you want to participate in that, that's fine. Just do it somewhere else, because I don't want to deal with your bullshit. This is a learning environment. You're not in here to decide to spout your opinions, because it's not your learning environment. Get 1,000 followers and do a live and teach yourself, because you have enough information apparently to teach. Otherwise, listen, try to not be so willfully ignorant about what is going on around you. Okay? Because that is what I am trying to combat, is the willful ignorance about what is going on around us, or just the unknowing of what is going on around you. And I'm trying to take it back a little bit further for a very specific reason. Let me go into that very specific reason. We know a few things that make us unique as a species. One of the things that make us unique as a species is the fact that we have 5 life stages from neonate, newborn, to adult, when our brain fully closes. Currently, that's 25. It was earlier before, but there are still those 5 life stages. Out of every species on the planet, we have the most life stages. We have the longest time period of brain development, right? This requires community to nurture. If you live in a time period where there's only 30 people in your community and there's big predators out there, and you have to get food for your community, and you have to provide tools for your community because you can't go to the grocery store and buy them, and you have to provide all of these things for your community, it takes an entire community of 30 to nurture somebody from neonate to adult, because while somebody is nursing a child, somebody else has to go out hunting or gathering to provide the food. to nurture that child. Somebody else has to tend the fire. Somebody else has to make clothes. Somebody else has to get water. If you've stopped nursing and now you're out hunting because women were hunters the entire fucking time, then maybe grandma is sitting at the fire taking care of the children. Okay. We must nurture as a community to allow any of our children to get to adulthood. So, to continue our species, we must nurture as a community. Another thing that we see with us that we don't see with anybody else, though we did see it in Neanderthals, is mandatory midwifery in childbirth. This is because of the way that the birth passage is shaped and the way our skulls and our shoulders are shaped. When we look at the birth passage of a biological female who is giving birth, what we are seeing is that, or as a birth giver, let's go with that, of a womb haver, of a birth giver. When we look at that, we see that the birth passage is shaped roughly like this, but it's actually tilted. It's not just like this, it's tilted. So when my head, which is nice and long from front to back, goes through that birth passage, and my shoulders, which are nice and long from side to side, goes through that passage, I have to be turned. So we start our passage through the birth canal facing backwards, which if somebody were to just pull that out would break our spine, right? So unlike all other species, we can't just pull that baby straight up to our chest because we'd break their spine. Not only do we have to not come straight up because we're facing backwards, we have to turn. You turn a quarter of a turn to get the head through, and then you turn another quarter of a turn to get the shoulders through. Okay. And then in that turning, we have to be midwifed. We have to have somebody help us with that birth. Now, we all know of examples where somebody, for lack of a better example, squats in a field and gives a baby, because we've all heard of that half of our lives. These are children that are usually very small, so it's a little bit easier to do. Or people who are highly flexible who can actually reach down and turn the infant themselves. I personally can reach up inside myself and feel my cervix. So some of us can do that shit, right? So this is because of that. It is not standard. And a lot of times those births don't go very well. So we have mandatory midwifery and we have the longest childhood, right? We have the most life stages. And because of these two things, we know that as a species, to provide species continuance, we must have community, and all of that community, male, female, doesn't matter, must nurture that child to its full development. Okay. So when we're looking at us as a species, and species don't develop things that are toxic to the species whole without outside influence. A species isn't going to be toxic to its continuation, and our continuation isn't pump, pump, dump, and walk away. If a man pump, pump, bump, dumps and walks away and leaves me taking care of this baby on my own, that baby's not going to live to adulthood. So we have to have everybody involved in that raising. So therefore, as a species, we are nurturing and we are communal. We're also very creative. We like to adapt our adaptations. We're really the only species that adapts our adaptations, right? A beaver has built the same dam for 100,000 years. They've never adapted that into a further adaptation, whereas we started out building shelters and adapted those shelters into apartment complexes as far back as the Romans, right? So when we're looking at that, we know that we are not only nurturing and communal as a species, but we are also adaptive. We adapt our adaptations, right? So we're curious. We like to know. We like science. We like to create, right? So because as a species, we are nurturing and communal and creative, as a species, we have always come across other people and gone, ooh, you're pretty. Ooh, you're interesting. Ooh, that's new information. Ooh, that's something cool. And we have always needed multiple people to create a nurturing communal environment to raise our children in. So if you've only got 5 Homo sapiens, that's not going to give you a nurturing communal environment to raise your children in. You need to grab another 5 of the Neanderthal or maybe 10 of the Denisovan to bring them into your community so that you have enough people in your community to ensure that everybody's needs are met. And this is, from our latest information, actually how our species came to be. Actually how sapien comes to be. It is through bands. Again, tribes are based on genetic lineage. A band is not based on genetic lineage. It is based on many different groups of genetic lineages or species even coming together to create a community. We are created out of bands. We are created out of many different groups of human species coming together to create one species. Okay? So when you contribute to the othering, to the hate, to the racism currently, to the uh, being against immigrants, especially if you're in a country where you're probably the fucking immigrant. When you are acting like that, what you are doing is contributing to our oppression. What you are doing is ensuring that we remain indoctrinated and we remain oppressed, all of us, because it doesn't matter what my skin color is. Unless I'm in the 1%, I don't eat very well. I struggle to have a home most days. Personally, I grew up dirt floor poor. And when I mean that, I mean literal fucking dirt floor. I don't mean people's ideology of it. I mean, we had a dirt floor, okay? And we didn't eat for months. Like rice and beans with nothing else in it was what we got for months, okay? That's how I personally grew up. So the idea that you should create division within the oppressed people in a group instead of going against the government that's trying to keep you oppressed, you're just contributing. You're just being a part of it. And you can be a part of it, but you need to do it elsewhere because I'm just not dealing with it. That's it. So when we're looking at the different species within us, we absolutely must understand that this does not equate to different race. We all have admixture. And the reason that we all have admixture is because we are curious, because we do like different things, because when we see something new and we see something interesting, we tend to have sex with it. We're really big about, you're interesting, you know. I know people who are specifically like, I like people that look different, right? I mean, personally, myself, I like, especially in men, people who look a little bit kind of kooky or weird or different. You know, do you have big ears and a crooked nose? Yay! You know, we as a species are really into differences. It's only in the indoctrination to try and keep you in your space that we lose that difference, that we lose that love of it. And we don't even really lose that love of it. We just act like we have. Okay. So don't contribute to it. Don't contribute to your own death. It's not acceptable. Or if you're going to, do it elsewhere because it's not the space. We do see 7 other species within us. Of the 7 other species within us, we know who 2 of them are. We know the Neanderthal, which again we see in everybody across the globe except for the Kwe population and the Oyo population of Africa. And we know who the Denisovan are. Who we do not know are the 3 ghost species within the Kwe population and the Oyo population. We don't know who the ghost species is in Indigenous Turtle Islanders, and we don't know, and Abialians, and we don't know who the ghost species is in Indigenous Australians. We do know that we have finds from those species, but we haven't found the species in the find. We have found their tool usage, we have found their work, but we haven't found those species. And we do know that we share a last common ancestor with all of those species because that's how we were able to breed. That's how we were able to get that admixture. That's how we were able to intermix because we have a last common ancestor in Homo erectus. And so we absolutely see that Homo erectus makes it across the globe. And we see that within the fossil record with Homo florensis and Homo luzonensis as well. Homo erectus makes it across the globe. And so we do see what we call multi-regional theory, which is the idea that several different species develop across the entire globe. And as we see those several different species develop across the globe, we see 6 in the fossil record. We see Neanderthal, who we found in the 1850s. We see Homo florensis, the Hobbit people down in Flores Island in Indonesia, who might actually still be alive. There is a doctorate of anthropology who has studied Homo florensis since they came into our discovery, who has studied Homo florensis since we discovered them. And that study of Homo florensis since we discovered them has turned up the fact that most people on Flores Island have documentation of seeing this species as recently as 50 years ago. So there is idea that Florensis actually still exists in this island of Indonesia, or this island of Flores in Indonesia. So Florensis was found in 2003. In 2012, we see the find of Homo naledi in the Rising Star Cave in South Africa. And that's what the Cave of Bones documentary is on that we were talking about, that Lee Berger has recently put out. It's a brilliant species that really shifts our understanding in a huge way and in a huge level. And I absolutely recommend that you look into it. I've done a lot on it. I've put out a lot of information on it. It's definitely something we'll be talking about more. After Naledi in 2013, or in 2012, in roughly 2013, we find Denisovan. And how we find Denisovan is because of the advent of polymerase chain reaction by Svante Pablo out of the Max Planck Institute, which he just won a Nobel Prize for. And using that ability, we start testing ancient DNA. And we have a cave, it's called Denisova Cave in Russia, that has thousands of bones of hominins littered across it. And so we started DNA testing that, and we found a fingertip, a phalange in that cave. And when we found that fingertip or that phalange, we DNA tested that and found a whole new species. And this is roughly 2013. In 2000 and see, I think 17, we start to find Luzon zenzus, okay? And Luzon zenzus is in the island of Luzon in the Philippines. And then we find that a skull that we have had for, I think, 40 years, I think since the 70s, we actually get another look at it and we realize that this is another species. This is Homo longi, the dragon man that was found in Long Cave in China. Now, when we look at this species, we're still not clear whether or not this is another species of Denisovan, or this is another Denisovan, or this is a separate species. And the reason is because we haven't gotten DNA from this skull, but we don't have a full skull of Denisovan. What we have is several different little pieces. We do have a bottom of a skull piece here for Denisovan, which does tell us that Denisovan had language, because you can see the brain imprint for language on that piece of the skull, because that's where the brain imprint for language is. So we do know Denisovan have language, but because we don't have a full skull of them and we don't have anything else or DNA of Longi, we're not sure if Longi and Denisovan are the same. Currently, we believe that we have 6 species we found in the fossil record, and that is the timeline in which we found them in the 6 species. We also see that there are 6 species within DNA that we don't know what the full genome is. We don't know what the species is. One of those we found within Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, and we do not see a similar marking within our DNA. And then 5 of those we have found within our DNA. Again, those 3 in the Oyo and Kwe population in Africa, the 1 in the Indigenous Turtle Islanders and Abiyalians, and the 1 in the Indigenous Australians. This tells us that Homo erectus makes it across the globe and speciates into roughly 12 different species at least. There might be more of these species out there, and we might have actually come in contact with more of them. They're actually doing so many studies within our DNA now. This is where we're finding these ghost species, that there could be ghost species that we haven't found within our DNA yet, or in Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. And because we are currently actually getting so much new information out of the ground and new fossils and new finds, there could be other species that we'll find in the fossil record as we move along. These are the 12 species that we see, and the 7 species that we see within us. Again, those 5 ghost species within us, and Neanderthal and Denisovan within us. With these, you can trace migration patterns. With these, you can see that Neanderthal really comes into our species really kind of before our species fully speciates even. And Neanderthal is global, again, except for the 2 populations in Africa, the Oyo population and the Kwe population, that have the 3 ghost species. But all of Africa pre-colonized, other than those 2 populations, absolutely has Neanderthal within them. And the rest of the globe has Neanderthal within them. We do see that the highest percentage of Neanderthal within somebody comes in Asia, in East Eurasia. And we do see that the highest population in the highest amount of Denisovan comes into with the Indigenous Australians and within Papua New Guineans. These are places that we believe that you would see the longest timeline of mixing with Denisovan. We do know that when we're looking at the mixing of us with other species, that mixing comes about from multiple interactions, right? Because of the way that 2 different species intermix, we know that you have to have a recent common ancestor. And we know that most of the mixings aren't actually fertile, are not actually viable. So they won't make it out of the womb. Say you have 10 intermixings between a Homo sapien and a Neanderthal. Of those 10 intermixings, 5 don't make it to birth. 5 aren't viable enough to be born. 2 don't make it out of toddlerhood or infancy. Another 1 doesn't make it past the teenage years. And of the 2 that are left, only 1 is fertile, right? So only 1 is able to pass its genetics down to the next generation. This is our understanding currently of species and our understanding currently of hybridization within species. Some of this is changing slightly right now. We are getting a little bit of more information. Barry, does the other lives not post on YouTube? All of these should go directly to YouTube so that you can actually look back over them. If it's not going directly to the YouTube and you can't look up the prior lives, Barry, please let me know because it should be able to let you look up the prior lives on YouTube. And if you would like to comment, I am also on YouTube. You can take that extra step to go over to the YouTube live. It's in Wita.org n.wita.org and you can comment over there. That extra step tends to keep the trolls out a little bit. So if you have questions that you need to get off the top of your head right now, you can do it there. Um, when we're looking at this and when we're looking at this migration pattern across the globe, there's a couple things that we should understand. Everybody outside of Africa, with the exception of Indigenous Australians, leaves the Levant, Saudi Arabian area roughly 50,000 years ago. That is the last common ancestor of everybody outside of Africa. Indigenous Australians have been there for at least 70,000 years. Currently, there is some thought process that Indigenous Turtle Islanders may have been here for at least 52,000 years, and this is through DNA evidence. So that might actually push that back just a little bit. I'm not exactly sure yet because that's brand new and they haven't fully gone through the testing and understanding. But our current, we absolutely know is that Turtle Islanders have been here and Indigenous Abialians have been here for about 35,000 years at minimum. Our oldest find here is in the very southern tip of Homo sapiens, not our oldest find, but our oldest Homo sapien find here is at the very southern tip of Mexico, and it is at 33,000 years ago. And because of the placing of it, we know that people are already in at least South America by the time this comes about. Because of the knowledge of the Denisovan DNA and where Denisovan DNA is found today, where Denisovans were at, and because of the amount of Denisovan DNA that we see within Indigenous Turtle Islanders, we now are looking at a southern boat route for Indigenous Turtle Islanders. This is something that I've kind of believed in for a long time and was looking for evidence on, and now they've got studies on it. So I'm watching these studies really eagerly. But when you look at the volcanic activity and the ring of fire in the southern Pacific, you see that these islands come and go all the time. Not only that, but we had a period of time where there was so much more of land mass in those areas. There's actually entire continents that are practically submerged now. And because of that, we're absolutely seeing that the route of a southern boat route is way more possible. We also know that, well, it is possible that there is some backward migration over the Bering Land Bridge. There's not a lot of forward migration over the Bering Land Bridge. It is mainly a backward migration. And the Bering Land Bridge is only open from 18 to 15,000 years ago. There is an idea of a northern kelp highway, which is a boat route to the Turtle Islands or to Turtle Island, North America. And that boat route is basically across northern Northeast Asia and then follows the ice along and comes over to North America or Turtle Island. So when we're looking at that, what we're seeing is this one is roughly, they think, 23,000 years ago. So what we're seeing is that the first route over to Turtle Island looks like it's about 35,000 years ago or earlier, and then it comes along the southern boat route. The second route seems to come across the Kelp Highway, a northern boat route. The Japanese had boats, like sailing boats, like 21,000 years ago. And so this northern boat route coming over is roughly 20, I think they want to say like 27,000 years ago. I'm not exactly sure. I think our oldest find in a cave up there in the Yukon is actually 25 to 27,000 years ago, and it is a horse bone with markings on it where somebody had butchered it. So we do see that there are 3 migrations to the Turtle Islands, or to Turtle Island and Abiyala. With that, oh, awesome. Okay, Gypsy. Um, So first of all, I do need to say that when we're talking about words that are actually slurs, that is actually one of them, just so you're aware. So I'm going to actually use Baxty instead. Um, when we're looking at the evolution of humans, there is even our start as a species comes from several different species converging. So everything about us, even from the very beginning, is many different species converging. Now, when we're looking at Neanderthal within us or Denisovan within us or with those other ghost species within us, what we're looking at is not a part of our evolution, but a part of our migration and admixture. And I say that because we don't see anything in everybody. There's nothing we see in everybody. The closest is Neanderthal, but there are still two populations that don't have Neanderthal, and we are a singular species. So they don't necessarily contribute to our evolution. They contribute to our ability to live in certain species. They give us genetics that give us that ability. We're currently looking at the Tibetans having the oxygen, the high altitude oxygen ability coming from Denisovans. There are people in the islands in the South Pacific. There's a space, and I think it's in the Korean space. I don't remember if it's North or South Korea. That the Jehu island, and the divers on that island have been known for a long time to be able to hold their breath for extended period. It's always women divers. And the thought process is that might also come from the Denisovan, just like the oxygen change within the Tibetan people. So there is things that they give us in different spaces that give us for adaptation to those specific spaces, but it's not an evolutionary step forward in any space. We are all evolved at the same level as sapiens. Um, okay. And then my thoughts on Graham Hancock's work. It's very racist. I've read Graham Hancock's books before. I've read Chariot Fire, all of these things that come out really early in my 20s as I was really starting to explore some other thought processes. Um, they're all based on the idea of the Atlanteans or something like that, a race of advanced people, almost always light of skin, who had this great catastrophe happen to them. And after this great catastrophe, they spread across the world. And that spreading across the world, they gave everybody the knowledge that they have. People got the knowledge that they have independently. People got the knowledge that they have because the world around them works that way, and because we've always been scientists. Even as far back as Homo erectus, we've always been scientists. And because we've always been scientists, even as far back as Homo erectus, we adapt, we look. The very first episode of Graham Hancock's thing that he's doing right now, the Netflix thing, he talks about the pyramids. And when he talks about the pyramids, I have to point out a few things. First of all, they don't all look the same. That's a ridiculous idea that they all look the same. The pyramids in Peru are rectangular. There are some periods in Tenochtitlan that are square, but they don't look like the pyramids in Egypt. They have differences in the sides, in the structures, in the way they are. They're not burial mounds. It's not somebody inside. There's not chambers. They have things on top. They have huge capstones along each of the four corners, right? The pyramid that he's talking about in Borneo or in Indonesia is not, it's not recognizable as what we think of as a pyramid at all. It is a stepped structure if it is human made. I've seen some later stuff that states that it might be, but when you look at Graham Hancock's work, none of Graham Hancock's work gives you the peer reviewed, meaning if I am carbon 14 dating something, carbon 14 dating, by the way, is not what we use for most things. Anything that we use carbon 14 dating on, we back up with something else because carbon 14 dating can be problematic. So when we're carbon 14 dating something or we're dating something, we put it into a machine. We take like maybe the soil and put that into the machine, and it's, analyzes it and it tells you what this is. And then we take that into another program that analyzes that a little bit deeper. And then we take that into another program that gives you a confirmed, right? All of those have numbers, all of those have readouts. The archaeologist that is working on that pyramid and stating these things about the pyramid in Indonesia hasn't actually supplied any of those readouts for peer review, which means that we don't know, right? If you really did that, then why don't you have the readings, and why are you not supplying them, right? When we're looking at things with science, we want to have anything that backs it up, anything that's evidence. Faith is I believe something just because somebody told me, but science is I believe something because I see fact. There's something weighted in it. So if you're trying to get me as a scientist to believe that something exists, you need to give me the evidence, because I don't just believe based on blind faith. Blind faith isn't helpful to anybody. So that's why I have problems with Graham Hancock. I would love for that to be a pyramid in Indonesia, or not Indonesia. I think it's Indonesia. Is it? I would love for that to be a pyramid in Indonesia. Again, it's circular, it's oval, it's not square or rectangular shape. I'd love for it to be a pyramid. I just need some documentation. Show me. I'd love for it to be a pyramid because it's like 21,000 years old. You know what we have in Borneo, in that area? Um, we have the oldest successful foot amputation at 31,000 years ago. People in that area have had medicine and science for generation upon generation before, the rest of the world, like even, I mean, I think that we all had it at that time, but before we currently conceptualize the world as having it, right? So I would love to have that evidence to back up the other evidences that we have, but he's not giving that evidence. And that's why I find Graham Hancock problematic. With that, let's go ahead and talk about that 31,000-year-old successful amputation that we see in Borneo. This is a 19-year-old girl. We know this because of the fact that her DNA states that she's biologically female and biologically 19. I do want to state, because we've talked about biological sex and birth givers a couple times, that biologically we have three sexes. Biologically, you can be male, female, or intersex. Intersex makes up roughly 2% of our population. That's the same percentage, though not the same people, of our population as redheads or people with green eyes. So intersex is actually a pretty prevalent part of our population. We're just unaware of it. So we do have three biological sexes, not two. So when we're looking at this find, her biological sex is female. We know that she's 19 years old from the DNA. When we're looking at this, we know that this happened 6 to 9 years before she died because of the bone remodeling. So what we're looking at is that one of the feet, Graham Hancock's name, it was just up there, so I have to find it now. So when we're looking at this, what we're looking at is a find that is 31,000 years old, that when they're uncovering it, they see that the lower foot, the lower limb is missing. And initially they're like, well, did the foot get misplaced? This happens. And then they take a look at the lower leg bone and they realize that there's actually remodeling and a cut to this bone. And this tells us quite a few things. So the remodeling on the bone, which is the growth after an injury to the bone. Remodeling is when I've injured my bone, it develops new bone. It grows new bones. So the remodeling on this shows that it was 6 to 9 years before she died. So, either her preteens or she was either 10 or 13 when this happens, or in between that. And it also has this very clean, very smooth cut underneath the remodel that we can see. This tells us that they used obsidian. Obsidian is such a hard substance that it is the one substance on this earth that we can sharpen finely enough that we can cut between atoms. They still use obsidian in microsurgeries because of the fact that it is the only substance that we can get to such a fine, sharp point or edge that it will actually cut between atoms, or between cellular, not between atoms, I apologize, between cellular structures. So when we're looking at this, we know that they used an obsidian blade because of the fineness of the cut. And then we can extrapolate a couple of other knowledges that medical anthropologists have extrapolated from this. The first thing that we can extrapolate from this is that they had to have a knowledge of anatomy to do this. They had to know where the blood vessels are, or that there are blood vessels there, so that they could cauterize those blood vessels so that she didn't bleed out. They had to know enough about the wound, or enough about making this surgery, that they were able to ensure that the end of the bone is covered. So if you don't want the bone to be exposed and infected, you need to make sure that the end of the bone is covered in an amputation. And how we do that is, if this is where I'm going to cut, I take and I pull this back. Let's go here. Take and I pull this back before I make the cut, so that when I release, the skin will come down over the rest of the cut. And usually what I'll do is I'll cut the skin like this in a flap, and then I'll pull it back, and then I'll cut the bone and the flesh. And then as the skin releases and the flesh releases, it'll cover, and the bone will kind of sink up back inside, and I'll cauterize the end of the blood vessels so they sink up back inside as well. And then I'll take that skin and lay it over the edge. And this prevents infection. We also know that, and we know that there was no infection because of the fact that she lived for so long after, and because we cannot see infection in the bone. So, this actually gives us a couple of other things as well. We know that they had to use antiseptic. They had to either, well, they had to have knowledge of antiseptic. We have antiseptic herbs in the area of the cave in which she was found. And so the belief is that they use those antiseptic herbs, probably both for a wash and to drink, to make sure that she didn't get infected after this. The other thing that we know is because lower limbs, when amputated, have a tendency to kill people. This is because of the shock that you go into. When your lower limb is being lost and you're awake, your body goes into shock because it knows you're never going to walk again. It knows that you have to learn how to walk again. It knows that you are now subject to predators, right? And so this tells us that you have to put somebody under. You have to give them like this pain meds and put them under. Now, we know during the Civil War that we did a lot of amputations and people died during those amputations of lower limbs. And those that survived because they were unconscious when the amputation started or because they were given morphine. There are many anesthetic herbs or herbs for pain and herbs to kind of knock you out in the area of this cave in Borneo. And so the belief from the medical anthropologist standpoint is that they gave her these herbs to put her under so they could perform this amputation. It's also known that this provides extensive care after the fact, and you have to learn to walk again, okay? And you're not going to walk very easily over a lot of rough terrain, which tells us that she had care after the fact. She had post op care after the fact, right? And she was taught to walk again. Somebody probably brought her a crutch and taught her how to walk with this crutch. All of this tells us that this wasn't the first surgery. All of this tells us that this is not the first amputation performed in this area. You don't get a brilliantly beautiful amputation your first time out. I did radiography before I did archaeology, and in radiography, I participated in a number of surgeries because that's what radiographers do. And in watching a number of those surgeries, I actually learned, and seeing films post-op of a number of surgeries, I actually learned a lot. And so I can personally tell you that this amputation is better than a lot of amputations today. Like the cut is so fine and so smooth, right? You don't see that in a lot of amputations today. A lot of amputations today don't have a very fine, smooth cut. A lot of the tools that we use in orthopedic surgery today are actually tools that you could find at Home Depot. They're done with surgical grade steel, so you can't really just run out to Home Depot and grab them, but they are the same style of tools that you could find at Home Depot. And so when we're looking at this, we absolutely know that this is done in a finer manner. This is done in a more precise manner than many of the surgeries that we do today. I therefore will state that to me, this surgery is a better surgery than many of the surgeries that we see today. And this is 31,000 years ago. You don't get that brilliant out the gate. You have to have some knowledge. And if you belong to a community of only a few people, roughly 30 people are in most bands at this time. Even if you belong to a broader community of a few hundred people, maybe you've got several different bands that live together in a broader community, several different spaces, like you might find several different bands underneath a singular nation today. You are still not going to get a whole lot of amputations. This is not something that you're going to be practicing a whole lot on. So this tells me that either this is somebody who has done a lot of these amputations throughout their life, maybe there was a lot of people that needed it, or this is a generational thing where there are surgeons and there are training and there is this understanding of medical care. This also tells us something about the value of people. Now, the people who did this study like to state that they think that this means that she was a high value member of their community, maybe like a leader's daughter or something like that. I do not agree with that. We are all high value members of a community when the community is this small. Everybody is a high value member. Even if all you do is sit by the fire and tend it, you are a member of high value to that community because you are continuing that community. You are contributing to that community. Even if all you do is paint walls, you are contributing to that community because you're contributing to the knowledge, you're contributing to the art, and you're contributing to the beauty of the community around you. Most communities prior to now don't need you to be high value to actually think that you have value. Today, we like to think that value is based on what you can be exploited for. And the fact of the matter is that is not who we have been throughout history. Throughout history, well, history is written word, so maybe throughout history, that has not been what we are throughout the entirety of our time as a species. Throughout the entirety of our time as a species, we had value just for existence because our existence continues our species whole. We don't have to prove high value, have academia, be really good at underwater welding. Like, you don't have to do that in these prior communities. Your existence itself is value to the community. So I do not believe that she was necessarily a high value member of community, but she was a valued member of community because everybody was a valued member of community. So I've gone over a little bit over the different species, and I've gone over a little bit over the amputation since I turned off comments. I'm going to go ahead and turn on comments for a little bit, probably only for a few minutes, and then I'll probably turn it on to subscribers only so I can read back through and answer any questions. Again, I'm going to remind everybody that everybody gets a space on TikTok to go live after they have 1,000 followers. I choose to use this space to educate because I do not believe that education should be gate kept behind $40,000 a year paywalls or verbose, huge language that people can't understand. Even if you have several degrees, sometimes you have to parse through. That's why I'm doing this. In my space, we don't do racism and we don't do gender or desire based phobias. I don't put up with them very well, and you're not going to like my response very well. And I'm going to ask you to keep them out of here. If you would like to tell me that you think I'm wrong about a subject, please tell me why. What you have information that shows that I don't know what I'm talking about. My sources are in this website right here, nwitaord.com. It has bibliographies on it. It is my website, not a public journal website, but it does have many journal websites that I have, or journal articles that I have compiled for this. Not all of them are journal articles. Sometimes it's hard because there are paywalls, and I might be able to get through those paywalls with my credentials, but you might not be able to. And so I make sure that there are articles that most people can access easily. And then you can dive a little bit deeper into things that you can access. Because again, I don't think education should be paid for. I think it should be free because education and knowledge helps us all. So go ahead and turn on the comments for a little bit. Again, it'll probably only be for a few minutes, and then I'll turn them on to subscriber only so I can read back through the questions. And I ask you to keep it polite, nice. I'm doing this because I love humanity and I want to ensure that we're doing better as humans. I would appreciate if the kindness and the love that I am showing is returned. Thank you very much. I'll turn them on now. How to make sure. Thank you, Tammy. Yeah, I was able to I kind of debated with them a couple and was able to get my lives back, thankfully. And it seems like the throttling that was going on is gone now. It seems like we're actually getting out there. It was weird that I was being more throttled after they gave me the live streaming studio access than I was when I was like on a suspension. Like, it was kind of weird, but we have found surgeons. They're more recent, though. We found a lot of surgeons in Egyptian archaeology, and there have been surgical tools that we have found in other spaces around the world. I can't think off of the top of my head what the dating on them is, though, but we have found surgical tools from a few thousand years ago or further back. Um, how did gender come into the hierarchies that we know today? Gender, to my personal knowledge, doesn't start coming in until we get to the Greeks, who start to, and really specifically only Athens, who really start to make women less than. Most of the other spaces, even at that time, are actually very egalitarian, right? We do get stratification in society, but we don't get stratification between male and female within society until later on. Our idea of gender today is actually really new. You know, we had our first operation to transition somebody in the late 1800s. Like, our first trans operation was in the late 1800s. Our idea that there's something wrong with people based on whether or not they change our perception of their gender or things like that is actually a relatively new thing, and it is really very Christianized. Like it is really mainly from a biblical standpoint. Now, that doesn't mean that it's only seen within Christianity. We definitely see it within other biblical based religions. The Quran takes a lot of its stuff from the Torah, takes a lot of its stuff from, well, there are many books of the Bible within the Quran as well. I spent like a year and a half on an Islamic school when I was like 7, 8 years old because one had come over from Iran and they lived near us, and that's where my parents sent me to school. And so I've read the Quran before. I was taught Hebrew and Aramaic as a child, and things like that so that I could read. It doesn't really, like there's a lot of biblical text within it. They're translated in an older translation. And there are many people within Islam that don't look at it the same way, just like there are many people within Christianity that don't look at it the same way. But you get those people who are filled with hate and they need to propagate their hate, right? I have seen Cave of Bones on Netflix. It's so amazing. I'm so in love with it. What is my perspective on archaeology only based on artifacts and architecture? My biggest problem with mainstream archaeology is that it doesn't like to take into account Indigenous thought. Here in the United States, we see that there are many archaeologists who are moving forward and trying to adapt and trying to bring in Indigenous thought process and Indigenous archaeologists and Indigenous anthropologists. But we also see that there are still a lot of people within the field who think that they know more than everybody. And so they're not willing to talk to others, right? They're not willing to be a part of other or to listen. One of these things really stood out to me. I had an article that I had to read for a class. This professor I had a lot of problems with, anyways. Um, and in the article, it was we talked to the elders in the area if they knew what it was used for, and they stated that it was used for this, but we're not sure. And to me, that's rude on a lot of levels, right? Like, why are you coming to me and asking me shit and then telling me that I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about, right? Like, that's kind of screwed up. Um, I personally believe that we need to be listening to Indigenous voices a lot more, especially when it comes to archaeology and anthropology, and involving Indigenous people in archaeology and anthropology. And I do know that there's a lot of movement within mainstream archaeology and anthropology to do that. And I do know that a lot of that movement has changed our understanding as it should, right? Has changed our understanding, has given us a lot more knowledge. I also know that, even while there is a lot of movement, there's still a lot of people who are really stuck in their idea that they're supreme, right? A lot of that comes from people's fears. A lot of that comes from cowardice. A lot of people don't understand that bravery is being terrified of something and stepping up anyways, right? And so a lot of people, instead of being brave and working through their fears and stepping forward or challenging them anyways, have a tendency to kind of live in their fears. And for a lot of people, they have to be top dog. They have to be the pinnacle of creation. And if they're not the pinnacle of creation, then what the fuck have they been doing this whole time, right? Whereas there's a vast group of us who understand that we're not a pinnacle of anything. We're just a part. We're just a part of the biome. And we might have been screwing up our position in the biome for a hot minute, but our position in the biome is to tend, and not to be known for a million years, right? So I don't work a lot within mainstream archaeology, and I definitely don't work within mainstream archaeology in the United States, except when I'm asked to come in and talk about colonialism, just because of the fact that I have a problem with digging up ancestors here. Most spaces here have asked ancestors not to be dug up, and so when you're out digging up ancestors of people who have asked you not to, it's rude to me, and I won't participate in it. Right? Um, let me I'm gonna like hit on a couple of questions as I see them, and then I'll turn them off and go back through everything. What language should Denny speak? We don't know. Denny is 90,000 years old and Neanderthal and Denisovan. So she probably spoke a combination of Neanderthal and Denisovan, but we don't know what the language of either of those groups would have sounded like. She did have vocal patterns. She did have vocal speech, our vocal communication, right? Pretty much everything on the planet communicates. Trees communicate with each other. Trees form clans that are matriarchal based within forests that are nations, and all of them communicate underground, right? And through the air, right? So trees communicate, plants communicate, animals communicate. But verbal language, we do know that Neanderthal and Denisovan had a verbal language. It's likely that Neanderthal, Denisovan, or I'm sorry, child is getting at me really quick. Um, when we do see that there is a lot of, or when we look at those earlier languages, we don't really know what they sounded like, but it is likely since everybody's kind of living in bands together, and that many different species are living in bands together, that those early languages are probably very similar to each other so that we're all understanding if they're not like really very close to the same language, right? Man. You're welcome. When do we become patriarchal, going from a matriarchal lineage to a patriarchy? So, lineage based and matriarchy, patriarchy is completely different. So, one more second. I'm sorry, YouTube. I'm going to put you over here for just a second. Sorry, that might have paused me. My child is asking me to send him something, and I need to do that really quick. Okay. Sorry, sorry if that paused me. I've got a kid over here going, "Mom, mom, give me attention." So I had to reply to his things. So the show on Netflix that I just mentioned is Cave of Bones, and it's about Naledi, and Lee Berger, the lead our archaeologist on it, does the show. It's pretty cool. Matriarchy and patriarchy are different from matrilineal and patrilineal. Matriarchy and patriarchy are based on rulership, and matrilineal and patrilineal are based on tracing. So we have many societies where a king might rule, but it's a matrilineal society. So the rulership traces through the mother's line. So um, if my brother is king, his sons don't inherit from him because they don't know for certain they're his sons. They could be his wife's sons by somebody else. Instead, my sons will inherit from him because we know that my sons came from my mother and he came from my mother too, right? So that's a lineal, and you can see that rulership can be either male or female in a lineal society. It's not based on how the lineal, or it's not based on sex as much as it's based on the lineage, right? Um, Matriarchy and patriarchy. So, patriarchy specifically is where men rule and women are submissive. Matriarchy is different. Matriarchy is where women are leading. It doesn't discount men as leading, and it doesn't actually put men in a submissive position, whereas patriarchy puts women in a submissive position and states that they're less than men. As near as I can trace this personally, we see the start of this with Athens, with the Greeks. We see this tie over into Rome, and then Rome kind of spreads that everywhere else. We do know that in ancient Egypt, queens could rule as easily as kings. There are like 17 queens in their own right on the role of kings. We know that in ancient Sumer, that women ruled as easily as men. They weren't very. We do see a shift in ancient Sumer where men are ruling more and women are a little bit more submissive, but it's roughly around the same time that you're seeing the Greek rising, or the rising of the Greek people. So it could be roughly the same time. Now, I do believe that these don't all root in Athens. Like, I do believe that patriarchy is not just from Athens, and that there are other places on the globe that have patriarchy and that it all combines. But currently, the earliest I personally can trace it is to Athens. Um, and then it translates to the Romans because the Romans are really like big on it. Um, Jasper, on my website, there's a tab that says tools or something like that, and there are some DNA sites on it that you can take your DNA to. A full genomic testing is the best that you can do, but they're $300 at their cheapest for a full genome testing. So getting like an ancestry or a 23andMe and then taking that test to other sites will give you more information that you're not going to get off of ancestry or 23andMe. Though it should be understood that ancestry and 23andMe only take a bit of your full genome. They don't take the full genome. So there's a whole lot of other stuff out there that you might be able to get from other things. You can take the 23andMe to, there's several different sites underneath the DNA tab in my website that will give you a deeper look at the 23andMe test and will tell you stuff that you're not going to see on 23andMe. And I've gone to a few of them, and most of them will do it for free. You got to buy to get their better, right? Well, to go up a level or two, you have to buy, but to get a basic breakdown, they'll give that to you for free on most of them. Awesome, absolutely. Okay, so it does seem like it's not too bad now. So I'll go ahead and leave it on for a little bit. Let's see if it doesn't get bad again. That'd be nice. Um, That's awesome, Foxbow. I know that there are a few matriarchy-based societies still out there. It's a really awesome thought process. There is absolutely, actually follow an Amazigh creator talking about the Amazigh people because the Amazigh people of North Africa are still a matriarchy-based society. Um, John's Bones on TikTok. He collects real indigenous remains. I hope you don't mean like he has those real indigenous remains himself. Maybe he collects information on them. Collecting remains is horrific, and actually like illegal. You're not supposed to pick up, like if you see an arrowhead out and about, you're not supposed to pick that shit up. You're supposed to turn it in, just because we have a lot of we've had to instill a lot of laws to protect people. And these are one of those laws that we've instilled to protect people. You can't just go out and grave rob anymore. We did a lot of grave robbing. Archaeologists did a lot of grave robbing. Archaeologists at its start was very grave robbery. How have I been able to balance my pursuit of knowledge, staying beautiful, and having a nice home? Well, I live in an apartment. I'm not sure how nice of a home it is. I've decorated it well, I think. Um, Thank you for calling me beautiful. Some days I believe it. Um, I just innately think that we're good. I innately think that we're beautiful instead of evil. And because I believe that we are innately good instead of evil, um, I believe, and I've been proven wrong many times. Not that we're evil, but I've been proven. I mean, I've been traumatized many times. I don't leave my home without protection most of the time. Like I have to have somebody with me or my animals or something like that because I don't do mails a lot because they're hard sometimes. But I just try to be the change I hope to see. Right. I just try to affect the change that I hope that we can affect within this society because I don't believe that this is who we are. Um, Can I speak more on the ghost species and what we know about them? I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to count down, give you guys another minute, and then I'm going to sub-only chats on so I can read back through these. I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to put any new messages out or ask any questions. So I'm going to give you just another minute, and I'm going to go ahead and put sub-only chats on, and then I'm going to read back through these. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and read back through these and try and answer as many questions. We'll turn it back on again in a few. I just want to make sure. I also love when things are discovered and basically prove Indigenous claims to be correct. That is one of my favorite things. I actually have an entire tab based on things that have proven Indigenous knowledge correct, just because of the fact that we really, really, need to show how Indigenous knowledge is correct in so many ways. Do I have a solution to combat these things? My solution to combat these things is what I'm doing, spreading knowledge, because I believe that if I can get enough people to see who we are innately, then maybe we can make change in the world. I think really the only solution that we have at this point is to shift our understanding. And I am fully 100% for land back. I personally believe that in returning land to indigenous people across the globe, because there are indigenous people across the globe still struggling to maintain their sovereignty. If we return land to indigenous people across the globe, then we can combat the global destruction that's going on that is caused by mono agriculture. And we can also maybe return to a more animistic mindset, which believes that we are a part of the biome and not set above to destroy. That's the only solution I have personally. Um, yeah, I'm totally anti Abrahamic thought process. I think that God's a narcissist and I have a problem with him. So I have heard before, Geo, and I think actually you brought up this. I don't I am Indigenous and grew up in Indigenous communities. So I have heard Indigenous thought process, Indigenous understanding, and our stories of who we were my entire life. So when I see things that prove those things, I'm like, here, look, information, it proves it. Tell them to shut the fuck up because we know, right? But I don't focus any of my studies to Abayala or Turtle Island. And the reason that I don't focus any of my studies to Abayala or Turtle Island, I will absolutely go out and correct other people in my field. I will bring information to other people in my field uh, because I need them to shift their understanding. I personally believe that I would rather, if it's easy for you to listen to me because of my light skin, that's pretty racist. Not like anybody here, but like if it's easier for people to listen to me because of my light skin, it's a pretty racist thing. So I would rather that people listen to people of darker skin who are also indigenous so that it's less racism, right? Like you should be listening to indigenous people about indigenous shit, right? So I don't really study the shit here. I would prefer other indigenous siblings to study the stuff here so that they can bring it forward so that it doesn't make it easier for you, right? Like, so not that I don't want everybody to have the knowledge, but I also don't want the racists for it to be easy for the racists. I want you to learn fully and completely, and you can't learn fully and completely if you're like, oh, some white girl told me this, right? And so I really don't put any of my focus or study here in Turtle Island or in Abiyala. I absolutely put all of my action into making sure that people here have more information that I might have, and into trying to build up communities, into trying to build up voices, into trying to uplift other people here so that they can give that information or so that they have that information or so that they can, you know, help get that through, right? Like I absolutely uplift others in that, but it's just not something I study for those reasons. Um, I do think that we had talked about this before, and that I had compared it to probably the same situation that you get with the Basque, which is that the Basque move into the Iberian Peninsula at the same time everybody else does, but where everybody else continues to intermingle and move and migrate and go back and forth, the Basque don't. They stay in their space. So their language is different and their genetics is slightly different because they've been in that space isolated for so long, like the Sentinelese have been isolated for so long. Um, that doesn't mean that they're different species. It doesn't mean that they've adapted into a different race or anything like that. It just means that they have that isolation for a few thousand years. I think that that's probably what's going on within that group of people within Mexico. Koshima or BGP might have more information on that. They're both people who really study the history of and are really good at that. And they might have more information on that, but I do not. The ghost species. We do not know a whole lot about the ghost species. That's why they're ghost species. We see the fingerprint of them in our DNA. We haven't even put out like what things that we think the ghost species give us. We just know they're there. And since we haven't found the whole genome of them in the fossil record, we have no information on them other than the fact that we know they're there. So there's not really a whole lot more to speak on with the ghost species. We can see that there are other species that were in these spaces, but we don't know what they looked like. We don't know anything about them. We just know that they were there. Going back through the questions. The show on Netflix that we talked about was Cave of Bones. Lee Berger is the lead anthropologist on, or lead archaeologist on it. It's an amazing story, or amazing documentary. I do have one of his lectures that he did last year before this on my TikTok, or not my TikTok, on my website right there. And that actually goes into some of the more discoveries that he actually didn't talk about in the documentary. So it's also something to look at. But Cave of Bones on Netflix. Um, Matriarchy is egalitarian. Matriarchy versus patriarchy. When we look at matriarchy and patriarchy, we don't see that matriarchy works the same way as patriarchy. So I do believe that we should be egalitarian. Matriarchy states that so you can have a matriarchal society and not have a ruler, right? You can have a matriarchal society where the elder women are listened to and understood as some of the leaders within the society, but that doesn't mean that men don't lead as well. It just means that the elder women are your primary council, right? There's still going to be men on the council, there's still going to be men who do different things, but they're the primary leadership. It's very egalitarian on so many levels. Matriarchy, unlike patriarchy, does not negate one biological sex. We do share pieces of DNA for language, and we do share the communication center. Neanderthal, Homo erectus, Homo denisovan, and us, we all have the ability to communicate verbally. We know this because of the pathways for language that we can see imprinted on the skull, and because of the chest capacity. The way our chests are, and the way our lungs are, and the way our rib cage are, creates this ability to speak and still have air that moves throughout. And the push of our rib cages, the expelling of our rib cages, and that push, this muscular, actually is part of what creates speech. So when we look at these other species, even if we haven't found a hyoid bone, we didn't find a hyoid bone for Neanderthal until like 5 years ago. Even if we haven't found a hyoid bone, we can see within their chest cavity that they have the capacity for speech. And then we also can see language pathways imprinted in the skull, because the brain will imprint on the skull and it will imprint some of those pathways on the skull. And so we see those pathways imprinted on the skull. Humans start having hobbies such as music, art, and dancing. So Homo naledi seems to have had those. That's one thing within the Cave of Bones that's really cool, is that we actually see artwork on the caves for Homo naledi. So that's 235,000 to 335,000 years ago. Homo sapiens starts getting these things roughly 60,000 years ago. I think the oldest burial, which we associate with this kind of thing because it's the understanding of a concept of outside of us, a concept of spirituality, which is associated with art and stuff like that. We start to see the first burials roughly like 90,000 years ago. But the first cave art we actually see in Neanderthal. The first self-decoration we actually see in Neanderthal outside of the recent finds with Homo naledi. And we start to see those roughly 90,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago, 63,000 years ago for cave art and decoration of self. Dancing and music is going to correlate with those. It's going to come with those or come down with those. Probably we get from cave art to music is probably, and our first music is probably going to be drums and probably going to be vocal music. But we do see evidence of flutes relatively early on. I think we just found one, and I think it was like 40,000 years ago, but I'm not exactly sure. I don't know about Cambridge and the Broad Institute, unfortunately. I do not know of a free genome test that will actually give you your test. But I do know of several places that you can upload your DNA, like Genome Link, and it will give you more information. That image of Denny is freaking comedy. I do agree. Like, this is the only image that I found of Denny that actually like gives her face, but I'm not sure I like this. The person that does these images, like, I don't usually use their images. I usually use Kenneth and Kenneth images or Tom Borklin images, but they haven't done Denny yet, and so this is the only image of Denny that I've found. Um, I have not seen the lizard. I don't usually look at anything other than human, like other than our line, really. The first modern day humans show up. So the first sapiens start around 300,000 years ago, but we don't correlate into one singular species of sapien until 125 to 130,000 years ago is the brand new evidence. And then brand new evidence in the last 6 months is the idea that we finalize the formation of the shape of our brains, which gives us the information that we do have, like it gives us our abilities that we have between 30 to 40,000 years ago. That starts roughly when we start burying our dead, though. It starts morphing our brain. So we start that shape change roughly 100,000 years ago, I would guess. But the finalization is 30 to 40,000 years ago. And again, this isn't, it just differentiates some of the things that we do. It doesn't necessarily differentiate whether or not we were human or thought like humans. It just differentiates whether or not we have the quick synapses firing is what they think it is. So there is some show that that might not be what it is. It might be something else that we currently have. That's disgusting, Naya. So I need to find that person because that's like extremely illegal. Finding an arrowhead and keeping it is absolutely illegal, though, books. And it is because of the fact that archaeology in its beginning was mainly grave robbing. Washington, George, actually documents watching an indigenous group bury a woman in a mound and then going out and digging up that burial and taking everything from that burial and putting it in his basement and showing people things from it. So this is what early archaeology did. And because of that grave robbing, we have laws in place that state that if you pick up an arrowhead, you're not supposed to keep it. You're supposed to give it to the local museum or the local nation. And there are a lot of stolen artifacts, and that is extremely horrible, horrifying. I some people have talked about Indo-Europeans having patriarchy. That's a possibility, but I've also seen where there might be a patrilineal within Indo-Europeans that there's not necessarily a patriarchy in Indo-Europeans, and we actually see that the steppes people, like the Scythians, actually were like their women were warriors, not their men, right? Like so. Whether or not we actually get patriarchy from them is actually going to be one of those things that we're not exactly sure. My partner has just woken up and I'm probably going to get off here in just a minute or two. So let me go ahead and turn this back on just so that I can give you guys all a chance to talk while I'm finishing this up, and then I'm going to go ahead and go. If you see people using rock art, arrowheads, anything like that, you report them to the Repatriation Act. I would call your local museum and ask them, who do I report this to? Because they will give you direct numbers to report it to. Genetic drift versus admixture. Genetic drift, the verbiage is hard for me really quick. So genetic drift, I believe, is where we're seeing people migrate, where we see the genes kind of drift in the migration versus admixture, which is where we're seeing extra people coming in. So like uh, mitochondrial DNA. We see L in Africa, we see M right outside of Africa, we see O here, and blah, 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 and it goes down. That's kind of like genetic drift. Whereas admixture is adding in an entirely new species or an entirely new genetic. Um, Thank you, everybody, for the follows. The Basque region doesn't actually have a higher incidence of Rh negative blood. There's actually like three populations that have 19% incidence of Rh negative blood, and the Basque is not one of them. One is in Africa, one is in Europe, but it's not the Basque, and one of them is in Asia. I will absolutely be dancing when Kenneth and Kenneth makes a portrait. Most Native Americans aren't going to sell actual bones. They might sell artwork. They might sell things like that. Usually they're not there are times where you will see Native American nations, where you will see nations that are actually selling artifacts or belongings. You will see that absolutely. This becomes a gray area. And the reason this becomes a gray area is because you can't tell me I can't sell my grandma's stuff so I can eat, right? Can't tell me that I can't sell my grandfather's stuff so that I can eat. Um, but you can tell me that I shouldn't sell my grandfather's stuff, right? Or sell your grandfather's stuff, right? Like if I sell my grandmother's stuff to you, I can tell you that you shouldn't be selling my grandmother's stuff, right? Um, so it does become a gray area. You do see some indigenous groups. Most of the time, it is absolutely as a survival method, right? And so when you see that, my first instinct on that is to state the fact that being a survival method, the best way to deal with that is help survival, like help people survive without having to sell grandma's jewelry, right? But there, it does happen sometimes. I've never seen bones sold though. I've never seen like bones of people sold. I don't know a lot about treaty law. Arrowheads, yeah, arrowheads, absolutely, and stuff like that, yeah, and that makes sense, and I do know that there are many nations who will sell stuff like that, and again, that is a survivability factor because you have a lot of different nations who are struggling to survive, right? Struggling for their children to survive, struggling to feed themselves. You get people most people don't know that the Dakota, specifically around the Standing Rock area, had half of their land stolen again in the 1950s and 1960s. There's actually a picture of their chief actually crying as he's being forced to sign away a bunch of land that was literally their most fertile land. It was where all of their gardening and all of their agriculture was done, and it had to be signed away to the government because the government dammed the river and actually flooded the entire area. And so they lost their most fertile grounds. So many nations actually have had their most fertile or their most uh, or the lands that can actually give them some form of stability stolen and sold even after treaties were signed, right? And so when you see that, Brand, stop. When you see that, you're seeing a lot of nations that don't really have another way to subsist, don't really have another way to feed their children's, right? Their children. And so you do see a lot of that stuff that happens. I am going to go. We've been doing this for like 2 hours. I will probably be back in a couple of days. Um, but my partner woke up and I'm going to go spend time with them. Take care. Much love. Remember that we are nurturing and we are communal, and othering is not natural to us. It is something that is being used to create a division so that the government can maintain control over you. So as long as you're out there othering, what you're doing is allowing governmental control over yourself and a governmental control over everybody. Remember that it is not the houseless. It is not the immigrants. It is not somebody of a different skin color who's trying to harm you. It is the government. And also remember that this depression and this anxiety and this pain that you're feeling because we don't have community is because you're living in an unnatural state. And it is those of us who feel that way who are necessary to changing that, to moving us forward, to getting us back to where we were. So if you are feeling extremely depressed, extremely lost, in pain, please remember that you are more necessary than most because you contribute to that change. You are needed, and please maintain that need and that understanding and stay with us because we need you. Much love, everybody. Take care, and I will see you guys, if not tomorrow, probably not tomorrow because it's Tuesday, probably Wednesday. I will see you guys Pacific Standard Time, and I'm going to try a little bit later in the day then so that I can actually get a little bit different time zone. Take care, everybody. So much love. Take care of yourself today. Give yourself grace and give yourself love today. Bye. YouTube. Much love, everybody. Take care. I will see you guys probably again Wednesday, and I'll do them back and forth like this again. And I hope you guys have a great one. And remember, we're nurturing, we're communal, we're creative. And it is those of us who are feeling this pain and this disconnect who are needed to create that connection again. Take care, everybody.